Today on Uncommon Sense, Albert and I will interview Matt Swaim, Director of Outreach for the Coming Home Network at EWTN. We'll talk to him about his journey to Catholicism and his relationship with G.K. Chesterton. Coming up soon. Hello and welcome to Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. I'm Grettelyn Darkey and I'm joined here with my co-host, Albert Sines. Hello, Albert. How are you?
Howdy, howdy. I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
Pretty good. And we are joined with Matt Swaim, as I said. Matt, how are you today?
I'm doing well. It's great to see you all over video. I finally met you all in person at the last Chesterton conference, so
yeah, I'm
pretty
sure.
cool to be with you via video.
Yeah, normally it's the other way around. Normally it's like, hey, it's great to finally meet you in person, but we met in person, and now we're going virtual.
We're doing it the right way around. You know, Albert was probably a bit of a blur for because I feel like he was.
Albert was like in every
Flash.
single possible capacity. Actually, both of you, like every job that was done at the Chesterton conference, there were probably like 25 jobs, and you guys did 24 of them between the two.
Yeah, so. Welcome to nonprofits everywhere, right?
Yeah. Necessity.
Necessity. But anyway, we are really excited to have you here on the show. It was your 10 minutes of fame at the last conference was great, and we're really kind of hoping to expand on that. But before we get into that, would you mind just giving us sort of a brief little bio of like who you are, what you do for EWTN, and just anything you want to share about yourself?
Sure. Well, I do a lot of things for EWTN. Especially considering that I'm not actually even an employee of EWTN. Much like the Chesterton Society has done many things for EWTN over the years while not necessarily being an arm. So I, as a host of the Sunrise Morning Show on EWTN Radio, that's a product of Sacred Heart Radio out of Cincinnati, and we provide a broadcast that they syndicate on mornings for, well, I don't even know I'm mentioning this. Like, people who read Chesterton don't get up at like 6 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. But if you do, you can listen on your local Catholic radio station if it's an EWTN affiliate and hear the Sunrise Morning Show from 6 to 8 a.m. Eastern, or depending on where your local listings are. Been doing that since, in one capacity or another, since 2007. Have interviewed Dale Ahlquist a whole lot of times in that capacity. And then the day job, the 9 to 5, as it were, is as Director of Outreach for the Coming Home Network, an apostolate that was founded by Marcus Grodi back in the early 90s as a way to help people come into the church, especially people who come from a ministry background in some Protestant career or other. And if people know us for anything, they tend to know us for The Journey Home, which is a program that we produce at our offices in Nashport, Ohio, and that EWTN is very gracious to run and has run now for 25 years, which is wild, and which Dale Ahlquist has also been a guest upon. So, yeah, that's the nutshell. So
that we'll take that. That's great. Well, let's just dive right in then. So I don't know where to start. Like either to bottom line your conversion story, or just tell us more about how you met Chesterton and what impact he had on your conversion.
I think it could be. I think he could probably mix it together.
Or both
I
and.
was about to say, it's kind of the same question, two different ways, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was very privileged to kind of revisit this thought when Dale asked me to do a chapter for My Name is Lazarus, because I had kind of trouble pinpointing like where it was that Chesterton came in. Like, I was working at a Christian bookstore as an evangelical kid, running the punk rock section, and trying to figure out where I fit in the evangelical world, and finding some bands who are making references to certain literary figures, people like Daniel Amos and others, and thinking I should really read more and read more of the classics. As a person who was playing in bands myself, I wanted to have more like creative lyrics, and like I wasn't finding that in the best-selling Christian living section of the late 90s. It was, well, it's not, well, that genre isn't exactly very poetic. So so getting into the classics, I discovered Chesterton a little bit, didn't really understand him. Went on to a Christian school, a liberal arts school called Asbury College, and took a class on C.S. Lewis in the Oxford Circle and was really interested in that. Had already loved Lewis, loved but didn't understand Tolkien, and in that we read like a short story or two from Chesterton. I think it was like a Father Brown or two. Then we got this new professor at the school. This is bear in mind, this is like a Wesleyan tradition school, meaning like mostly Methodists, a very small town, central Kentucky, like no Catholics anywhere. And a new professor offered this class on G.K. Chesterton, like a Chesterton seminar. And I was like, well, I've read him. He seems like an interesting old Christian person. I should probably dive into this. I was a media communications major trying to like fill out my electives, and I took it, and I just fell in love with Chesterton in every sense of the word. I read The Man Who Was Thursday, didn't completely understand it, read The Napoleon of Notting Hill and was obsessed with it. And a few other things like distributism. I was struggling with like, how does a Christian fit into like the political landscape in the United States of America? This is around, the early 2000s, and like the questions of like the Iraq War and like the religious right and all these things that like an evangelical's wrestling with. And I just found Chesterton, and he just hit me between the eyes, and he seemed like he was right about a lot of stuff, and the stuff that I wasn't sure if he was right about or not was stuff that I'd never thought about before, so I wasn't sure how to argue with him. So there was a lot of that going on. I would eventually go on to play in a bunch of bands. The easy way to say it is that the tour bus broke down in Cincinnati, and that happened to be the first Catholic town I'd ever really lived in. And then it's one thing to like toss around Catholic ideas when you're living in central Kentucky and can do these as like theoreticals. It's another thing altogether to toss around Catholic ideas and have to drive past the Eucharist, at like 100 churches in like German Cincinnati. And so that's like the short version, but I can tell you that Chesterton got me thinking about the world in a completely different way. And it wasn't until I was really confronted with the reality of living in a town where the Eucharist was that I had to come to terms with that. But that's sort of the short version.
Beautiful. Then we're getting your spiritual suntan, as Fulton Sheen said.
Blessed Carlo Acutis would say that too, right?
You're affected by the Eucharist, whether you know it or not. That's great. Do you remember what your first Chesterton was that you read?
Yeah, it was Heretics, which, if you are an evangelical kid whose only experience of reading like evangelical literature is a bunch of people who are still alive, and then you pick up Heretics, you're like, what in the HE double hockey is this? Like, I had no idea who he was even yelling at in that book. Like, it was just one of those things where, Family Christian Store, may it rest in peace, was like the Walmart of Christian bookstores. It had, we were store like 235 or something like that. And so our Christian Classics section it only went back a couple hundred years. So when you read Chesterton, he's obviously not talking to whatever the arguments of my era are. He's like engaging stuff that's like way deeper and way bigger. And so a lot of people say, I pick up Chesterton, he's so confusing to me. Chesterton was confusing to me, but it wasn't because he was making arguments that were confusing. It was just that he was arguing with people who I'd never heard of. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my first run with Heretics. And Heretics was the first book. And so when I took that class, having read like one or two Father Brown stories, it was my attempt to try and figure out how to sound smarter or something. And
get
try
some
to figure
depth
out like
in your lyrics.
Why is this guy like a Christian superstar if nobody knows what he's talking about? So nobody in my world, at least.
Matt, would you say that it was one stronger than the other that sort of finalized your conversion? So you find Chesterton and you're sort of on fire because Chesterton's saying all sorts of things that you don't fully understand but are obviously engaging to you. Could you say, oh yeah, it was Chesterton all the way that really sort of brought me? Or was it Chesterton was the beginning of the journey and then it was more of self-discovery after that?
Oh, wow. It's a difficult thing to try and articulate. So I was primed to be open to Chesterton by a number of things. Among them, growing up as an evangelical in the 80s and 90s, it was a very practical form of Christianity, meaning that it was very much like it all hinged around like one question: what must I do to be saved? And it's a very kind of essentialist understanding of Christianity. I mean, you meet Catholics like this too. It's like, what boxes do I have to check in order to technically make it through the system? I mean, there were aspects of that to it, but it had more to do with the way that we understood it as evangelicals was more of like, Christ must save me, and anything that gets involved in that conversation outside of what must I do to be saved is a distraction, right? So, I mean, you hear this a lot when people talk about their complaints about Catholics and like beautiful churches or statues or saints or the Blessed Mother or like all this stuff. It's like, clear it all out of the way. What must I do to be saved? So, I mean, I had a lot of that going on around me. A lot of frustration with what was going on in the temporal order. Evangelicals who don't have a visible church, but do have like the United States of America and think about it as the new Israel, are like, oh, it all has to happen here in our country. We are the fulfillment of all the biblical prophecies. And like, there's a lot invested in that. And so there's not as much sort of devotional freedom to like explore and like, I'll be like a kid in like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. It's more like, what must I do to be saved? And so that was all going back in the background. It also is because I was playing in a bunch of bands. I had experienced a lot of failures among leadership in the Christianity that I was a part of, and so I was trying to figure out like, how do I get to Christ and like get beyond all the frustrating experiences I've had. And when you're in that headspace, well, a few different things are are going on. Pardon me. One of them is that if you're like truly a Christian kid, an evangelical Christian kid, like, the world is not selling you with its secular materialist philosophy. Like, that's not the truth. You also know like this like packaged like evangelical thing is not it. And so for me, I dove into the one place that was like critiquing both the secular materialist worldview and the packaged evangelical worldview, which is the Christian punk and metal and hardcore, music underground. And those are the people who were also reading books. So they were also the people who were engaging pieces of scripture that I wasn't hearing as often in my evangelical worldview. And they were more interested in trying to figure out like questions about wonder and beauty and how this all fits. So when I was playing in these bands and we go to these, youth group coffee houses and we'd play a bunch of shows, and I'd be playing from, writing songs from what I knew was a Christian worldview, but the youth pastor would be like, hey man, you guys didn't give an altar call. What's up? Or you guys didn't play a bunch of praise and worship songs. What's up? Like, there was this thing in me that was like, I feel like being a Christian is more than praise and worship and altar calls. So when I discovered Chesterton, like, he's got this like whole overarching sense of wonder and beauty and like seeing Christ in all things, and like every joke is like a hint that God is real. Like every baby's smile is somehow like a window into the divine. Like, that was something that I was like primed for from coming from that background. So when I met him, I was already kind of ready to meet him, as it were.
There's I feel like with artistic people too, there's sort of this natural feeling that like art is unnecessary to, the
It's not practical,
completely practical
right?
world, right? So you sort of have this feeling of like, either I fit or I don't. And if you're living in this totally practical space and you're not, just doing the praise and worship and doing the altar calls to serve the purpose of why art is important, quote unquote, it can be, I would imagine that could be pretty frustrating.
I mean, it certainly was. And again, there were some Christians, so, I mean, ultimately when I came to this conviction that I had to become Catholic, it was because I was reading into at least sort of contemporary thinkers who talked about Christianity and the arts in that way. Chesterton was one of them, for sure. Flannery O'Connor. Actually, I don't think I realized until years later how big of an influence she had on me,
Mm.
and actually a whole bunch of different ways. Um, Walker Percy, Madeline L'Engle, an Anglican, Dorothy L. Sayers, an Anglican, C.S. Lewis, obviously an Anglican, Frederick Buechner, an Anglican, and many others, but like a lot of Catholics as well. But there's this one weird thing that they all had in common. And we were actually talking about this because we've been reading the Screw Tape letters around the office at the Coming Home Network. It's like our little book study, like our office book study. And there's this thing that Screw Tape says about how, you know, just because someone is a churchgoer and a communicant doesn't mean that we can't still get them. Like when I read that the first time as an evangelical, I'm like, I don't know what this communicant thing means, but it, whatever, man. Like Lewis is talking about this kind of thing. Dorothy L. Sayers, the Anglicans and the Catholics are both talking about all this stuff in the context of a worldview that has the concept of sacraments in it. And we didn't have that. Like, so, I mean, Chesterton was kind of like my guide to help unlock, like, what might a worldview look like if it had the sacraments in it. I didn't know that's what he was doing to me. I figured out later that's what he had done to me, but that's a big part of it.
That's really cool.
So, sort of continuing off of there, would you say still sort of in your life that Chesterton has an ongoing impact on your life, not just sort of, what he did to sort of propel you forward in those first years, but that, yes, Chesterton is still very relevant to me right now? And if that answer is yes, how is it that Chesterton really impacts you?
Yeah. Well, actually, to answer that in the most Midwestern way possible, yeah, no, yeah, for sure. So, so the interesting thing about Chesterton and the way that he kind of like constantly calls me to account, I mean, he's obviously a product of his time, right? Like any of us, there are things that you see and you don't see because of where you live and how you are formed. But at the same time, Chesterton, in the ways that he transcended that, he did so in ways that are gifts to anybody in any era. Because, well, in every era, there are people who are trying to create contradictions where paradox is the better way to understand stuff. If I had a nickel for every time somebody who's a talking hairdo, which I can say because I don't have hair, right? Like on one of the cable news channels or on like the radio stations, it's like, well, we live in a polarized culture, a polarized this, a polarized that. Like, yeah, we do, but that's because we don't understand how the world works or should work, right? Chesterton is learning to think that way as I came into the church, really kind of helped me get the both and aspect of Catholicism. Because we encounter it all the time. Like, oh, well, the church should either have good liturgy or it should help the poor. Like, what are you talking about, man? Like the church, if the church is the church, it should be both, right? She should be firing on all the cylinders. And so I think about Chesterton all the time in that regard. Like, his Paradoxes of Christianity was like a mind-blowing experience for me once I really understood what he was saying in that chapter in Orthodoxy. Like, should a Christian feast or fast? Well, yeah, Should a Christian be celibate or have a bunch of babies? Well, yeah, like this is all part of like the fabric of reality. So, I am fond of saying that there are only two kinds of people in this world: people who accept false dichotomies and people who don't, right? This is like an era of just like false dichotomy upon false dichotomy upon false dichotomy. Like, if you want to know why like everybody's polarized, it's because they're pitting things against each other that shouldn't be pitted against each other. And Chesterton really helped me see that the church is like sanity. It's like, well, by taking things that are furious opposites, keeping them opposite and keeping them furious, right? I'm messing up the quote, but
It's the idea church, of balance. Yeah.
Right. It knows how the pieces are supposed to fit together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't remember. It might be in Orthodoxy, but he has that great quote about basically like the extremes sort of balancing each other. And you
Yeah.
can have, there's another great quote. Again, don't remember where it's from. I'm not Dale. Um, but
Who is really?
Dale is Dale. But he has this quote about Thomas Becket, and he says, he was wearing his vestments of gold, and underneath he had a hair shirt, and he got the benefit of the
Yeah.
hair shirt, and then the congregation got the benefit of the gold vestments. And it sort of embodies that idea that within the church you can have all these extremes. There's room for punk rockers, and there's room for classical musicians, and it all works in the way that it's truly universal and truly does capture everybody.
I will say this though, just to get you into like a better Chestertonian headspace on this question. People who listen to punk rock out there are more likely to want Gregorian chant in the church. It's people who listen to Loggins and Messina out there who are more likely to ruin your church music. Just putting it out there.
I would totally believe that. Oh man.
I have to note that one. I'll have to
Metalheads care about good liturgy
Yeah.
and good architecture.
I've sung
look at a
Bach,
metalhead.
and I've listened to Bach played by metalheads. So because a lot of those
Go look
guitar riffs
at the tattoos of your most metal friend. Do they look more like a yoga studio or a Gothic cathedral? That's all I'm
right.
at. That's just my only question.
I now have to go get metalhead friends. I can't say I have a metalhead friend to be able to compare.
All I'm going to say, build the kind of churches that your metalhead friends want to get tattoos of. That's all I'm saying.
Amen. I'll buy
You
that.
mean that they don't want to get a tattoo of a square box?
Yeah, with like some like chunk glass. Maybe, I don't know.
Oh man.
Not compelling. Not compelling.
Yeah. No.
So
They want the heart of Mary with like 7 swords sticking out of it. That's what your metalhead friend wants.
I could see that.
That's all I'm saying.
I could see that. I want to trust them, but I have to say, as long as it's tastefully done, I do have to. I have to put that in.
And you should. And you should.
So you have your own experience with Chesterton, and you've been good enough to share that with us and your conversion. If you were going to try to pitch to the audience, and obviously people are listening because they are Chesterton fans, but let's assume that someone's listening, they're not a Chesterton fan, they haven't picked up a Chesterton book. What would Matt Swaim say to the person, hey, you should read Chesterton because this?
Because everybody is like stuck in their own little pods, and they've got their own way of thinking about things, and the little challenges to them seem like contradictions. And Chesterton, to me, I was in a pod. I was like in a little evangelical pod, and a lot of people who were in those evangelical pods with me got one challenge to evangelicalism or purity culture or whatever it was that was their like evangelical pod, and suddenly they've like deconstructed into total agnostics. There's more than one way to break out of your pod. You can break out of your pod and say, oh no, everything I've learned my whole life is a lie. Or you can say, maybe there's a different way of thinking about stuff. And Chesterton, for me, was a very, very helpful guide to start thinking about things in a different way. I mean, he talks about Christianity as the key that fits the lock. And in some ways, like, Chesterton's way of thinking about these things was like the key that fit the lock to understand how to think about the church as the key that fit the lock. So, I just say this, like, if you get onto like social media and all you see is like two dummies arguing past each other and think there's got to be a better way to think about life, to think about truth. I mean, Chesterton's refreshing, and also because Chesterton was able to like get along with people who like completely disagreed with him. That was another refreshing thing for me, is that I could see how he was arguing with various ideas, but I also would read about his like bio and figure out like some of these people that he's like going after are actually like his drinking buddies. Like, that's kind of strange. Like, what if that were the case here? Like, what if you could argue with somebody and still like be friends with them? Like, that's crazy. So yeah, I mean, that's a couple things I would mention about that in regard to him.
Nice. I feel like in a certain way you're really making an argument for Chesterton like as a punk rocker. I'm getting this sort of like alternative countercultural vibe. I love it. I think it's great. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, I mean, if you think about Chesterton, like, what are okay? So to paraphrase him again, I wish I've had all my Chesterton library around me with all my highlighted things, but like, most people are generally right about what's wrong, right? I mean, you look at any punk rocker, they're right about what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They're mad about mostly the right things, right? You look at anybody who's like getting upset and causing revolutions. They're most of the things they're mad about are stuff that's pretty worth being mad about. The question is that the world is made up of more than things to just be mad about. The world is also made up of beauty and truth, and not just a defect of goodness. So, I mean, he's got that pretty much nailed.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And beauty and truth are actually part of the antidote if you're open to it. Yeah. Beautiful. I just want to take a minute to remind our listeners that if you're enjoying this chat we're having with Matt, you can find his talk from last year. He was part of a conversion panel at last year's conference. We have a link to that in the description. It's available to purchase for a very reasonable price at our store. You can hear a little bit more about Matt's conversion and some other guys from the book. My Name is Lazarus, which you can also purchase from our store. So I encourage you to pick those up and take a listen, take a read, and learn a little bit more.
So, Matt, I think we're getting up here close to our roundabout ending time. As we talked before, we're a little loose on the time compared to actual radio. But I guess as a closing, we're here to talk to you because you've had a large conversion of life. And how many years has it been actually since your conversion?
I came into the church in Easter Vigil, March of 2005.
Okay. So we're coming up on 20
while.
years here in a couple more years, right? So
Pretty
20
close.
years.
Pretty
All right.
Close, yeah.
So we've heard from you. You've talked about the importance of Chesterton, but on that conversion train, if you were going to try to encourage potentially others who are maybe on the fence a little bit, and we're not here to push anyone. Everyone has to make their own decisions. They have to use their own free will. But if someone had a question to you and they said, okay, you converted, Chesterton was a part of it, what would you kind of tell the person who's sort of, waffling a little bit, saying, can you give me something, Matt, like some just sort of encouraging words for a step to take, a thought to consider, something that Chesterton said that might ring and help them a little bit on their own journey?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on. I mean, Chesterton speaks to almost every worldview. It kind of depends on what worldview you're coming from. But I know that we live in kind of a universe where a lot of people are stuck in the none zone, like the NONE, like wondering if any of this can be true. Maybe they've never grown up with any kind of concept of faith, or maybe they grew up in some kind of concept of faith and it, exploded and blew up in their face, or what have you. I know all kinds of people who've been wounded by trying to pursue some sort of faith, and they're hungry and they've been burned. And so if that's you, like, very often the friends of mine who are in that world have kind of said, okay, well, then all we've got left is the political order, right? All we've got left is what we see. And that's what we got to work on. That's how we got to vote. That's how we got to be activists and lobby and do the best that we can. And guess what? That's like if you think religion's disappointing, try throwing your whole like eschatology into like the midterm elections. Like, it's just, but Chesterton has this thought, and again, I'm going to paraphrase, but he says something to the effect of, the people around me in this world said that this world is all there is, and that we were one day going to make it better, right? But I probably am going to die before that happens, right? But the church said this is not my home. I'm made for something better. And he's like, that was a window into like a possibility of freedom. That everybody's telling me like the world is okay and amazing and beautiful and it's going to work out. I'm looking around and that's obviously not true. The church is saying you can never expect this world to have all the answers, but that's okay because you're made for another world. So I would just say be open to that concept. And if you are, then Chesterton is a wonderful person to help you get how that all works out in practicality.
Beautiful. Thank you. Very nice. Well, I think that's a really great way to wrap up here. So just want to thank you so much, Matt, for coming on with us today. It's been great talking to you.
No, thank you all for the invitation.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Remind you again to everyone to go to our store and find more Matt Swaim, and listen and read and discover more Chesterton. And again, thank you, Albert, as always, for co-hosting. It's always a lot of fun.
Always, always so good to be here.
Wonderful. And thank all of you for listening. We hope that you will subscribe so you don't miss a single podcast. And join us again as we have more wonderful guests and talk more about Chesterton, because as always, Chesterton is always better with friends. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next time.